Hi, this is Little Dwarf playing games while rambling incoherently into a microphone. Why? Just because I can, and I continue with Kingdom Come Deliverance, Blind. Now, this episode will contain nothing but me reading the codex, and seeing how there's like 100 positions, it's probably going to take around, I don't know, a couple hours. So there's nothing else that's going to happen in this episode. So if you're not interested in me reading the codex and, you know, commenting on it, you can just skip this episode and I'll resume the normal gameplay from the next one. So yeah, maybe see you then. But that's enough of an introduction. Let's go on with the codex, because as I said, there's 77 entries in this category alone. Alchemy was a discipline of combining mysticism, hermeneutics, chemistry, physics, and many other spheres of learning. Medieval alchemists worked in laboratories, often situated at a nobleman's mansion or in royal cities. They found application in smelters, mints, mines, glassworks, and whenever industrial production needed assistance. The work of alchemists was challenging and costly, and so required the support of patrons. Successful alchemists earned wealth and fame, while the unsuccessful ended up in prison or were sentenced to death. Two fundamental alchemical objectives persisted through the entirety of the Middle Ages. To find the mystical philosopher's stone, and to transmute base metals into gold. Yeah, I was actually mentioning that second part in the very first episode when I learned there are potions in this game. In KCD, we use a genuine preserved alchemical laboratory as our model, though the minigame itself is adapted for practical use. Instead of processing mercury and sulfur, our cauldron cooks up herbal concoctions. Okay. In the Middle Ages, a significant part of any property ownership consisted of livestock: horses, goats, cattle, and poultry. Horses were highly prized, and until the 12th century were only available for nobility, for the military purposes, and for light hauling. The change came in the 12th and 13th centuries, where horses came to be used for transport and tillage. In Bohemia, horses began to be shod from the 11th and 12th century up to the 13th, only as a rule on the front hooves, and later, when horses were used for heavier works, on all four. Almost every serf in the Middle Ages would prefer to own a cow than a piece of arable land, so even some landless folk had access to food by way of milk. Curiously enough, in the Middle Ages, milk and dairy goods were not traded much. For one thing, many people had a cow of their own, but also because of no effective means of milk and dairy product preservation was yet known. Sheep were kept by both serfs and the upper classes, largely for their wool. The poorest also kept a goat for milk and cheese. Pigs were left to forage in the woods all year round, feeding on beechnuts and acorns. Medieval pigs were much like wild boar and had little in common with today's pink animals. So I guess that's why they are so brown and hairy in this game. The most commonly kept poultry were chickens, and only rarely geese or ducks. All cattle grazed freely on the meadows around the village. In heavy winters, the livestock was kept inside the house, even sharing the same room with the people and serving as a source of heat. Yeah, to be honest, from what I know, it was not uncommon for for peasantry to literally like have a house that consisted of a single room where, you know, all of the family lived and also the animals during the winter. So it must have been, you know, quite an uncomfortable situation. Armor. In the 14th century, manufacturing capabilities grew to include the forging of stronger and often combined armor. Plate armor was developed thanks to the improved steelmaking techniques and the ability to beat out larger sheets of metal at forging mills. The soldier's head was protected by a helmet, for example a kettle helm, the sallet, or a great helm. Armor was crafted by platesmiths and helmers, often from one piece of tempered sheet metal, skullcaps and salays, or riveted together from several smaller pieces, kettle helms or great helms. The best armor of the early 15th century was considered to be that made in Germany or Italy. Combination armor was used by heavy cavalry. It was based around chainmail, supplemented by plate armor on the limbs, and a simpler version of a cuirass or a placard, or just a gambeson, quilted breastcoat. Some cuirasses and breastplates were equipped with a hook to support the knight's spear or lance in combat. If the armor lacked a hook, the spear or lance was lodged in the bouche and notched in the shield, which covered the left arm controlling the reins and the lower part of the helmet. A very common type of a helmet was the bassinet, with its distinctly shaped clap visor, giving rise to the name houndskull. In addition, pictorial sources frequently show iron hats, often with one or two viewports. The shoulders were protected either by a chainmail sleeve or by pauldrons. An essential part of the armor was the shield. Armory. This was the place where the military equipment was kept, or the civic militia's repository. Swords, spears, halberds, bows and arrows, crossbows, suits of armors, helmets, and other offensive and defensive weapons and firearms. Yet, to be honest, never mind firearms, although to be honest, at this point, black powder would have been, a regular, maybe not a common occurrence at battlefields, but a regular enough occurrence at battlefields. But why are there no crossbows in this game? That's pretty weird. A crossbow was like a staple medieval weapon. In fact, it was like considered to be, a weapon of mass destruction. Like there's actually been papal decrees forbidding Christians the use of crossbows because they were so feared for their potential to breach plate armor. Like, it was seen as a borderline sacrilege, this idea that an unwashed peasant man-at-arms can just shoot down a knight in plate armor and just murder them, with a single bolt. Why are there no crossbows in this game? To be honest, given that it's, high Middle Ages, at this point, if they only had resources for one type of ranged weapons, I think it would make more sense if there were crossbows but no bows, rather than the other way around. In times of a threat, it was the duty of all residents to defend the city, and for these purposes, the city had an armory with enough to arm its residents. Even in times of peace, the townspeople often had to take turns on guard duty. Astrology. In the Middle Ages, alchemy and physics were naturally linked with astrology, which was regarded and applied astronomy. Since ancient times, fate has been considered the expression of divine will, emanating from the heavens and giving mankind signs in the constellation of stars and planets. Indeed, the Arabs and the ancient Greeks had made tables, schemes and catalogues of stars and constellations, as well as calendars used for navigation. The movement of celestial bodies had an influence on political issues, on decision of war or marriage. Even medical treatment, food preparation or tasks associated with agriculture were deemed to be subject to celestial mechanics. Based on the constellations, every person was assigned a sign of the zodiac, which determined his health, career, and social relationships throughout his life. Astrologers used many devices in their works, such as astrolabes, sextants, quadrants, sundials, and other devices for accurate monitoring of the skies. Unlike today, astrology was highly regarded and respected science, and many astronomers of that time were also astrologers. Okay, because obviously nowadays astrology is considered, pseudoscience. Obviously, it's borderline belief in magic. No reasonable person believes in astrology anymore. But as this tooltip notes, it was much different back in the day, and it was considered entirely legitimate. Baptism. Under Christian doctrine, baptism is the ritual of shedding of original sin, and salvation cannot occur without it. Original sin condemns all people since Adam to die. In the early Middle Ages, adults who consciously entered into the Christian fold were the ones baptized, while at the height of the Middle Ages, baptism came to include even young children. If a child died prematurely, i.e. unbaptized, its soul could not go to heaven, nor could the body be buried in hallowed ground. Baptisms took place mainly on religious holidays, especially at Easter, and churches would have special baptismal fonts for the occasion, the baptistery. Actually, I haven't seen any baptisteries in the churches in this game. Beverages. There were shortages of clean drinking water due to pollution of watercourses by human activities around rural settlements, and fruit juices were available only in the season. Hence everyone, including children, drank beer. The beer brewed at home was weaker and heavier than today, contained 1 to 5% alcohol, and served instead of soup. It had no head of foam, was brewed from wheat, so-called white beer, or from barley, old beer. Only in the 15th century did hops came to be added for better quality, bringing out the bitter flavor. Wine was drunk primarily at court and in the monasteries. It differed from today's by its spicy, sweet taste. It would be condensed into a thick syrup and diluted with water. Spirits were altogether rare. Distillation took place in small volumes. Fruit and cereal distillates were again weaker than today's, about 15 to 20%. The most popular drink was mead, made from fermented honey dissolved in water. Yeah, so I did know the part about everybody drinking beer because of the alcohol content. It was like considered. Well, it simply was more sterilized than the water, which could have been polluted. It was more difficult for bacteria to survive in a drink that contained ethanol, right? So that's why it was actually healthier to drink it than to risk drinking polluted water. Books and libraries. Collecting and preserving written records goes back to the ancient times, but the barbarians who sacked Rome in the 5th century destroyed a great many, so a lot of rare manuscripts have only been preserved indirectly via the Arab world. Various materials were used to write on: pieces of fabric, papyrus or vellum, fine animal leather. Parchment was expensive and therefore was only used for codices and deeds of privilege due to its significantly longer lifespan. The most widely used material was paper. The writing implements used included a quill pen, engraver, brush or red cane, charcoal and chalk sticks. The transcription of books was the monk's domain. Each book was unique, carefully decorated, and the text enriched with botanist illustration, all done by hand. The production of a book took many years, making them very expensive. Major works that came into being in Latin, but during the Middle Ages some literature began to appear in the respective national languages. Books were heavy as to be hard to steal and contained great many pages. Although there were some miniature handbook formats too, there were books so massive that they couldn't be carried by one man. Not only because of their value, but to protect them from destruction, important writings were often kept in chests or cabinets. Only later did libraries come into being, where the volumes would be tethered to the reading desk by a chain. Libraries were needed by administrative offices and places of learning, especially universities. The largest collections were to be found at Sorbonne, Oxford and the University of Prague, where the books were donated by Emperor Charles IV himself. Notable members of nobility or the church also boasted private collections, despite the fact that not all of them could read. burghers. In the Middle Ages, the relationships between townsfolk and villagers were not particularly good. Townspeople, not only those enjoying the freedom of full city rights, but also the poor, regarded themselves as higher ranking than the agricultural peasants in the villages. Often enough, they did indeed have higher social standing due to their trade and business profits. Towns were the economical and cultural centers, but it was the country that provided the goods, especially foodstuffs. In a medieval town, the best properties around the square and the market were owned by rich councillors and merchants. Around them lived the craftsmen and artisans, and the poor by the city walls. The townspeople's livelihood stemmed largely from trade, skilled crafts, and many associated professions. Like today, the townsfolk bought their food at the market. According to some sources, Prague at the time of Charles IV had some 40,000 inhabitants. At this time, London had about 80,000. Paris was comparable to Prague, although the Czech capital covered a larger area. The nobles did not generally live in the cities, but resided on their own estates. Burial. Records of burial are as old as mankind itself, but Christianity radically changed all the customs around interment and linked death inextricably with religious rituals and blessings. Before one's death, one had to be absolved of their sins by confessions and penance and receive the last rites, and where there was imminent likelihood of death, for example when going off to a battle, extreme unction was given just in case. One's final resting place was also of importance. The best places were deemed to be inside the church, in the walls or underneath the floor, followed by the closest proximity. Hence, cemeteries sprang up right next to churches, often in the very center of the village. The cemetery, hallowed ground, became an integral part of towns and villages and a regular meeting place for people, where they even traded and closed contracts. There was no sense of bereavement as we know it today. The dead and the living coexisted side by side. Only suicides, criminals, the sick, heretics, executioners, unidentified strangers, and unbaptized children were buried outside the cemetery in unhallowed ground. During the plague epidemics and wars, the customary funerals were done away with, temporarily, with a frequent need for mass graves. In later centuries, for reasons of hygiene and contamination of underground water, most of the old cemeteries were abolished, even involving exhumation and reinterring outside of town. It was common for those facing death to make at least an oral will, and also to forfeit some of their assets, if they had any, to the church for facilitating their passage to the next world. Burial of commoners was conducted in a simple wooden box or sack, while the deceased being wrapped in a shroud. Funerals of the wealthy and ruling classes were a different matter entirely. They were costly, ostentatious ceremonies with all the attendant pomp and circumstance. Royal funerals were attended by thousands of people. Wealthy families had their final resting places in a church or a crypt, marked by a tombstone, while the custom of the mausoleum came later. Camping. In the Middle Ages, countries were constantly being crossed by marauding groups of soldiers, brigands and guardsmen in various sizes, or lone combatants who often changed their place of abode. They lived in makeshift huts, shelters or tents around a central fire. Some stayed at one camp for several days. Others set camp only for one night and moved again the next day. One important factor of their choice of a campsite was the ready availability of water, food, animal fodder and firewood. Very rarely they camped in villages or by a castle. This was reserved for overnighting by the nobility and their entourage. During wartime or while on the run, they would sleep in the open, since there was no time to raise or break down tents. The noblemen's armies also camped at the sites where provincial militias were gradually gathering, or while awaiting the arrival of reinforcements or allies. The longest lasting, sometimes up to several months, were encampments for laying siege to strongholds, or those on riverbanks, waiting to engage the enemy forces on the other side. Tents were intentionally erected close together for security, mimicking battlements. The largest tent in the center of the camp belonged to the commander. Nearby tents housed nobles and high-ranking soldiers. Surrounded by simple shelters and huts for the ordinary soldiers and their horses, there was no need to camp together in one place, and an army could make camp across several locations. In the larger camps, there would be a field chapel, an infirmary to care for the wounded, and sometimes even a makeshift brothel. Simple tents in the Middle Ages took a shape of a capital A, with a square base and a distinctive central pole mounted on two upright stands. The tent canvas was most often made from flax or hemp, undyed for ordinary soldiers, but variously colored and decorated for the commanders. The men slept on the ground on mats, skins or pelts, but the nobility and the churchmen would have travel beds. A long-term campaign was challenging logistically, supplies always being the responsibility of the administrator of the nearest affiliated township. If the army was on hostile territory, it would send provisioning detachment to procure food and fuel. When supplies run short, it was time to move on to another location or give up the campaign. The worst occurrence was an outbreak of any epidemic in the camp, since hygiene was difficult to maintain. While waiting for those developments, there would be quarrels, duels and fights, which could escalate into a bigger conflict and significantly compromise the army. Disputes, therefore, had to be judged, and if necessary, severe punishment meted out. Okay. Carts and wagons. In the Middle Ages, wagons were used for transport, agricultural work, and for wartime purposes. One of the simplest was a two-wheeled cart, while hay wagons were also to be seen. The oldest high-wheeled cart had one central axle connected to the undercarriage. From the 14th century on, twin-axled four-wheeled wagons came to use. The front axle was not steerable, resulting in a very wide turning radius. Wagons did not have a seat for the coachman, who either rode astride one of the horses or walked alongside the wagon. In wartime, a wagon could be turned into a mobile field palisade, a strategy that became famous especially during the Hussite Wars, when the strategy of wagon walls won more than one battle for the Hussite forces. Yeah, that's right. That's actually that's something that they were very famous for, because they used the wagons, in the Hussite Wars to like protect against cavalry, because it was like a moving wall basically. You could set it up almost like a barricade or a palisade. Chronicles. Since the earliest times, it was the task of the educated members of the court or spiritual leaders to take on the writing of chronicles, literary works describing contemporary events, the lives of the rulers, great battles, and sometimes even everyday life. Records were kept in chronological order, as well as given the dates, to provide a wealth of historical information. They are among the best sources for investigating and revisiting the history of a country, famous people, places, buildings, and day-to-day affairs. There are different types of chronicles: world, national, episcopal, monastic, royal, dynastic, provincial, urban, biographical or autobiographical, travel journals, and more. The most important Czech chronicles include those of Cosmas and Dalimil, the Canon of Vyšehrad, the writings of the Sassau monk, and the Zbraslav Chronicle. The chroniclers generally enjoyed the most favorable conditions. Most lived at the courts, had free access to all the written records and courtly life, and plenty of time to devote to writing. Although chronicles are the most valuable historic source, when reading them and extrapolating, their historical subtext has to be kept in mind. For example, Cosmas wrote his chronicle with unabashed sympathy for the Przemyślids, while Dalimil showed great antipathy towards the Germans. Both occasionally mix up facts and myths and legends. For example, the beginning of the Czech history with the building of the Tower of Babel. Okay, that's quite a stretch. Some of the old books to be found in the game are transliterations of chapters from Cosmas or Dalimil. For example, the account of Forefather Czech or the Maiden's War. Okay, this is actually very interesting, because I've been wondering about it, whether some of the texts in the game are actual, abridged versions of historical texts, and I guess at least some of them are. Church was not just a place of worship, but also an important communication center in the medieval society. Its basic layout consisted of the central nave or aisle, sometimes with side naves, and a sanctuary which included the chancel. This housed the main altar where the mass was served. Most churches are aligned with the chancel at the eastern end. At the main entrance was the baptismal font. Another important element was the pulpit, from which the priest addressed the congregation. By contrast with today, the sermon was separate from the mass. Okay, interesting. I didn't exactly know that, I think. During the church service, the priest stood with his back to the congregation, and in keeping with the papal instruction, the Mass was said in Latin, which was not generally comprehensible to the congregation. In compensation, the church walls were highly decorated with painted scenes, intended to bring the mystery of the liturgy, and especially the biblical scenes, to come alive for the illiterate common people. When not used for religious services, the church premises would serve, for example, for temporary storage of grain and other goods that were being traded, or as a place of assembly for the citizenry if the need arose to address some important public issue. Okay, the latter part I understand, but the part where they used it to store trade goods is kind of weird. Clothing and fashion. Clothing for villagers and other commoners, above all, had to be comfortable, durable, and practical. It had to last for years and be worn in all kinds of weather. It generally consisted of simple shirts and tunics. Men also wore linen knickers down to their knees, and in winter they wore hooded cloaks, fur jackets and caps, fur jackets and hats. Wide-brimmed hats protected the heads from the sun, and footwear was simple. Most items were of natural colors, without ornamentation. An exception was festive apparel, intended for special celebrations and church holidays. In towns, clothing had greater significance, reflecting status, wealth, and even membership in certain factions, such as the tradesmen, soldiers, or apprentices. Accessories included belts, bags, gloves, hats, and other head coverings. Most of the garments in Kingdom Come Deliverance are based on actual historical records of medieval fashion. Hairstyles. In the 14th and 15th century, unwed young women had long hair, which they wore down or in braids. Women in town adorned their hair with ribbons, hairs, wreaths, or vines. Older married women wore pearled nets on their heads, white or colored veils or hats. Fashionable men in the 15th century had long, coiffured hair, and they liked to shave their chins. They covered their heads with brimmed hats, caps or hoods. Jewelry. In the Middle Ages, jewelry was fashioned from gems, wood, leather or metals. All gold tended to be worn around the neck and breast rather than on the hand. The most common type of jewelry consisted of earrings and the various types of crosses. The most common motifs adorning jewelry were flowers and animals. Figural decoration was often associated with religious themes. Rings were very popular in the Middle Ages and were worn for both prestige and symbolic meaning. They were either made entirely of metal, mostly bronze, or in rare cases silver plate or copper wire, and adorned with precious stones and worn on all fingers. Footwear was made of leather, cow, calf, or goat, as well as grass, straw, bast fibers, wood, cloth or felt. In the countryside, people often went barefoot in the summertime. Shoes were originally made from a single piece of material and fitted with straps. Soles, left and right, on the shoes first appeared in the mid-14th century, while heels were added in the 15th century. The most common type of footwear consisted of sandals that covered the entire sole of the foot and slippers made of wood or cork. Stitched shoes could be either low or above the ankle. Okay. A conciliation cross. Conciliation crosses, or merely stones with a cross engraved into the surface, were erected in place where tragic events or important historical events in the life of the community or the country had occurred. They were closely linked to criminal law, a symbol of admission of guilt and a plea of forgiveness. The conciliation cross embodied repentance by a perpetrator of a crime built at the culprit's expense. In addition, conciliation crosses marked the boundaries of estates and municipalities. Courtliness, or courtesy, stands for courtly etiquette. The cradle of courtesy was France and later England, where the patterns of beauty, education, diplomacy and the arts were formulated. The origins of courtesy are considered to be the chivalry of a knight towards his lady, adoration, versifying, greetings, gestures and obedience. Not overlooked were the rules for conduct during feasts, stylized movement, for example, mounting a horse or sitting down at a table, as well as protecting the ladies and the weaker, or the manner of divulging one's own feelings and emotions. Important elements in this were the language, the playing of musical instruments and dance. Many considered courtesy to be a fad, but despite this, for quite a long time it dominated the high society's approach to manners and art. Dugout shelters. A dugout shelter is a form of a smaller and more makeshift housing, one room dug into the ground with steps leading down into it. It was covered with a simple thatched roof. Those were home to poor people, or a provisional shelter for woodcutters, charcoal burners and shepherds who did not live in them all year round. Ecumenical council was an ecclesiastical assembly of representatives who discussed and debated on a topic of faith and administration. For example, the Great Council of Constance from 1414 to 1418, which lasted for 4 years and dealt with the issues of the Reformation and the Papal Schism, and also condemned the preacher Jan Hus of heresy, resulting in his execution by burning. Entertainment and games. The medieval nobleman spent his leisure time hunting, playing games, singing or playing musical instruments. Special entertainments consisted of tournaments, dances and plays. Books were rarely read because they were rare and expensive, and most of the nobility was illiterate. In the countryside, there were also many opportunities for amusement. Work was still strictly forbidden on church holidays and Sundays, and there were many more feast days than there are today. In the case of certain professions, the working week could also be interrupted due to weather or unpredictable events. In all, there were probably about 190 working days in a year, roughly 20 days per month, or 4 or 5 days a week. The most popular medieval board games were chess, draughts, checkers, backgammon, mill, also called nine-man Morris, something which looks like a Nordic region type of word, fox and geese and dice, Ball games were also played. Chess were costly and time-consuming to play, and therefore restricted mainly to noble circles. Burghers favored draughts, and common folk were fond of simple games, of dice and mill. Cards and card games already existed in Europe at the end of the 14th century, but only spread more widely with the spread of printing. The bourgeoisie, emulating the nobility in their leisure time, took to bird shooting, for example. During the 15th century, archery fellowships began to form in township. Gambling was also widespread during the Middle Ages, regardless of gender or status, which is evidenced, for example, by the Majestas Carolina Act of December 1357, in which Emperor Charles IV forbade gambling at Christmas time and commissioned the Prague Archbishop Arnost of Pardubice to penalize offenders of any social class with fines as well as spiritual penance, in extreme cases even excommunication. Execution places were situated on hilltops or at crossroads and out of town, as they were considered unclean. These were deserted places that everyone avoided. No craftsman would work nearby for fear of losing his reputation. The only one to be seen thereabout was the executioner, who often lived close to the site. Common folk would approach the gallows or the execution place for the sole purpose of witnessing an execution. Executions became popular folk entertainment, often with the whole town gathering to watch, but sentencing to a capital punishment was a right granted only to selected towns, and by no means all of them had their own executioner. Fabrics. Fabrics were made from plant and animal fibers. Bast fibers were especially used from the very beginning, from willow and linden trees, as well as various grasses. Later on, particular plants were selectively cultivated to be particularly suitable for cloth production, such as flax or hemp. Hemp fiber is tougher and darker than flax, but unyielding, hence not suitable for clothing, and better utilized for ropes or strings. Cotton was unknown in Europe until the late Middle Ages. The most widely used animal fiber was wool, for its good insulation properties, high absorbency, flexibility, and the ease of dyeing. It was combed or shorn from sheep. A highly prized and rare import from Asia was silk. Faith and devotion. Christianity was adopted in the Czech lands as early as the 10th century, though certain pagan practices remained until later, especially in rural areas, blending seamlessly with rising Christianity. Some of those folk customs were rather later modified according to the church instructions, others continued unchanged, and yet others were eradicated completely under church pressure. In addition to a deep faith in saintly patronage, the saints Wenceslas, Vitus, Nicholas, Ludmila, Adalbert, etc., the Middle Ages revered the Virgin Mary and the various patron saints of the professions. One of the manifestations of medieval piety consisted of wayside shrines, conciliation stones or crosses, put up in large numbers in villages, at intersections, and along the main byways. In royal cities and liege towns, it was important to collect the holy relics, remains and memorabilia to mark the saints. The cult of the saints was encouraged, and cathedrals and churches gained prestige with the relics they held. It need not be emphasized that most of the relics were fakes, and nobody took much issue with it. Devotion was shown in everyday life and accompanied everyone from cradle to the grave by the way of the church rituals. Occasions for worship, religious holidays or regulations. For example, the numerous fasts or Lenten days. In some ways or other, everyone believed in God. For complete atheism, we have to look for later centuries. Farming. Unlike today, when the land has long been given over to agriculture, the burgeoning of farming in the Middle Ages brought the need for new fields, where there were only forests or untilled land. The timber from the forest clearing was used for construction, the remaining roots, stumps and scrub were burned, and the ground then leveled. The finished fields were cultivated by a three-field system. A third of the land would lay fallow for 2 years to recover nutrients. It was used for grazing livestock, which added manure. It was then returned to use and tilled, while in turn another third, which had been used for rising crops, was left to lie fallow. This was thus the regular crop rotation to save exhausting the soil. In the earliest times, plowing was done with a simple device called an ard or a scratch plow. Where the soil was stony, working was very hard. The tiller had to keep watching the plow and used great force to push it into the ground. Sometimes clumsy and imperfect. Similarly, clumsy and imperfect were the harrows of the time. After harrowing, any remaining clods of the earth would be crumbled with a mattock or a wooden hammer. This work was typically done by women and children. The most common crop, wheat, used to be full of weeds, and as such not very economical. 15 large sheaves yielding only about 18 kilograms of grain, and often less. Harvesting often had to be done using only a sickle for cutting. After drying, the grain was thrashed out. Vegetables and legumes were cultivated to greater extent than today. Grown in fenced gardens next to the house, these were mostly peas or lentils, but also veg and beans. And around villages, flax and hemp were grown exclusively, or rather extensively. Hops were grown in signorial fields for the liege lord's brewery. Feudalism. Feudalism is a political system based on land ownership, which originated in the early Middle Ages and followed on from the decline of the Roman Empire. Its foundation was the fiefdom, feudum, a certain area, territory or land that the owner lent out to the others. The ruler, either secular or religious, was the natural feudal senior, suzerain, sovereign liege, and those allocated his fiefdoms were his fiefs or vassals. The handover itself came with pomp and ceremony, during which the vassal promised allegiance and military aid or other services to his feudal lord. The contract could be rescinded only by death of one of the parties, or in case of a material infringement. Not only could the liege lord have several vassals, but a vassal could have several liege lords. In the event of a war, one had to choose side by one's contractual tenure. Feudalism also determined the relation of the poorest class, the serfs, who worked on leased land, paid dues out of what they made and provided for their master, his soldiers or officials or for a monastery. It was called a quit rent, a source of wealth made mainly for the nobility. Portions of the land were subleased, so the king vassals, in turn, became the liege lord of his own vassals. Folk songs. Folk music, as distinct from church music, inclined to major scales and was more joyful and upbeat. In Bohemia and Moravia, it was for centuries a part of rural everyday life. Most of the songs were passed down by oral tradition, while a few can be found in hymnals and chronicles. Some have been preserved to this day in variations. Food. In the Middle Ages, whether a village or a royal court, the foodstuffs used were mostly those sourced locally: vegetables, primarily cabbage, onions, parsnips, turnips, beets and garlic, and to a lesser extent carrots, celeriac, parsley, cucumbers, melons, legumes, peas, lentils, veggies and beans, fruits, apples, pears, cherries and plums, berries, nuts, seeds and cereals. Eggs, milk and cheese were available all year round. Depending on the wealth, availability and the season, there was meat, venison, poultry and fish, and from abroad spices, fruits and condiments, including saffron, dates, figs, nutmeg, pepper, sugar, ginger and cardamom. Food was flavored with oil, vinegar, salt, honey or herbs. The most popular kind of food in the 14th and 15th century were thick broth soups, purees, and sauces for dunking bread in. The bread was rye, with white bread only available at court. During feasts there were fish dishes, using herring for example, roast meats, sausages, minced meat, and black pudding. Desserts were made with almonds, marzipan, sweet purees with fruit boiled in milk, or with added cream, jam, and preserves, baked fresh, dried and dry fruit, and assorted cakes. In rural areas, gruel and porridge of various kinds accounted for the bulk of the diet. Meat was expensive, and hunting in the forest was prohibited. All the game belonged to the aristocracy, which was mostly compensated by eating fish. Many ingredients that are common today were unavailable in the Middle Ages, such as potatoes, tomatoes, sweet corn, peppers and rice, with the latter made their way to Europe after the discovery of America or as imports from Asia. Foreigner. Since ancient time, a foreigner meant not only one who came from outside one's own town or village, and therefore was a potential enemy, but also any person without legal status. Foreigners were without legal rights until they paid a surety. These matters were handled by a court of law, and there were various legal regulations setting fees for running a business or renting a house. Foreigners were not allowed to acquire or inherit ownership. The Bohemia lands were long open to foreigners, relatively speaking, with lively trade and cultural exchanges. First were the Celts, then Germanic tribes, and later the Slavs, but a large portion of the populace consisted of German-speaking people. The Germans were mostly courtiers or worked entrepreneurs and merchants. Relationships with the Germans were neutral at first, cooling off later, and ending up with animosity against all things German, although that was still far removed from the strident nationalism of the 19th century. Worse relations existed between the Czechs and Germans on one side and the Jews on the other. They lived outside of society, which often, having gotten permission from the king for a handsome prize, carried out pogroms against them. What? I didn't know that pogroms were like officially sanctioned. This sentence, do I understand this correctly? They lived outside the society, which often, having got the permission from a king for a handsome price, carried out pogroms against them. So it makes it sound as if it was actually a legal right to massacre the Jews if you paid the king enough. Like, what? I didn't know that. Like, obviously I know there were pogroms, and basically people like hating Jews is like unfortunately and regrettably a sort of long-standing tradition. They were very much distrusted and kind of disliked for a really long time, even back in the Middle Ages. But I didn't know that pogroms were something that you can apply for a permission to do. Like, what? I might read something more about it, because it seems pretty weird to me. Plague and disease in the mid-14th century affected migration, and fewer foreigners came to Bohemia. During the Hussite Wars, most of the towns had a majority Czech citizenry. Only the main centers of Moravia remained largely German: Brno, Iglau, and Olomouc. The Czech language gradually permeated from rural society to higher social strata. A fundamental change in how language and ethnicity was viewed came with the Hussite Wars, in which the most Czech speakers identified with the Hussites, while most Germans supported Sigismund and the Pope. This was exacerbated by the foreign, often German crusades, summoned by Sigismund against the upstart Hussites. Frescoes. Medieval frescoes were intrinsic to the architecture and held both a decorative and educational function for the illiterate population, showing in simple terms the wealth and superiority of the nobles and detailing biblical stories or scenes from the lives of the saints. Extensive work of art was used in larger residences, monasteries and churches or palaces, fashioned by specialized painting studios. Less significant buildings were decorated by local individual artists. Painters in the Middle Ages did not tend to sign their work, and thus largely remain anonymous to this day. Most of the paintings were created following a strict, formally conceived designs and templates, so the styles of individual authors did not differ that much. The aim was not originality, but to portray the particular scene masterfully. Furniture. At the beginning of the 15th century, Czech furniture was made of planks and boards, using construction of various intricacy. The timber used was oak, fir, walnut, linden, ash, larch or spruce. The surface was treated with beeswax or linseed varnish. By the end of the Gothic period, shellac varnish came into use. Staining was done by smoking, using fermented cabbage water, or blanching with lime water. Tables and chairs had much the same design, with flat side panels or X-shaped board. Chests were made in various sizes for keeping dry goods, garments, or other small items of property. Townspeople slept on beds with drapes. Village homes were simply furnished. The peasants made their own furniture from split and dressed planks and posts. In peasant cottages they slept on beds of hay or straw laid on the ground. Joiners and carvers decorated furniture with ornamentation. The most expensive furniture had metal elements which served to brace and reinforce, as well as having a decorative function. Most of the furniture in KCD is based on medieval examples from the 12th to 16th centuries. Greetings. The basic form of greeting was bowing, with numerous variations depending on the occasion and the mutual status of the participants. A light bow with the hand on the heart would befit two noblemen of equal rank. A deeper bow was a more respectful greeting to a guest or someone of a higher standing. The next level was to kneel on the left knee and bow the head in deference to rulers, barons, or high-ranking commanders, and it expressed allegiance. The person would have to remain in this position until invited by his superior to rise. The most subordinate level was to bow while down on both knees, an expression of complete subjugation, often combined with a plea, typically for mercy. Doffing headwear was a practice that came into Burgundian fashion in the 15th century. Loyalty was expressed by kissing the rings of magnates and prelates. It was not proper to kiss the hands of ladies, but they were given a deeper bow than their social rank alone would elicit. Particular forms of salutation were also applied when addressing a certain person, for example in writing. A townsman was to be addressed as honest, a baronet as esteemed, and a titular lord as highborn. In the countryside, people greeted each other according to their nature, often mentioning in their greetings the wishing of good health, prosperity and God's blessing, or making reference to Christian tradition. God bless, Christ be praised, etc. Guilds and crafts. Medieval town society was made up largely of craftsmen and merchants who ensured the socio-economic growth. Based on their freedmen rights, they could exercise their craft and had the right to a market. In addition to privileges such as the protection and the support of the town's operation, healthcare and food provision, it was their duty to pay taxes on every sale or transport of goods outside the town limits. In essence, the status of the municipality was dependent on them, hence it was important that they did not relocate or ply their trade elsewhere, passing their occupation on to following generations. In the space of 1 century, several craftsmen of the same profession would be active in town. These artisans gradually began to form themselves into groups with political and economical rules, or members' guilds. They had their seals of office and pennants bearing the guild crests granted by the monarch. Each member of the guild had the support of others, and they all agreed on prices and regulations of sales, and the rules of apprenticeship and discharging from their duties. No one without guild membership could trade in goods. Healing herbs. Herbs played an important role not only in medieval cuisine, but also in the foundation of the healing arts. Knowledge about herbs was disseminated either by the word of mouth between herb women in the country, or between monks and scholars via ancient script. Many herbs could be taken in form of teas, concoctions by prolonged cooking, infusions in scalding water, or as extracts, tinctures, alcohol leached, or steeped in vinegar, juices and concentrates for gargling. Adding honey or sugar did nothing for the efficiency of the herbal salves, but it did help the medicine go down better. In addition to ingestion, herbs were applied in form of creams, ointments, poultices or oils, emulsified or diluted in water. In certain cases, the advice was to sleep on cushions filled with dried plants. It was believed, especially in rural areas, that the properties of the herbs were affected by the particulars of when and how they were gathered. For example, on a midsummer night, at midnight, etc., accompanied by special formulaic incantations or enchantments. Heraldry is the doctrine of characters and symbols depicted on coats of arms, governed by fixed rules, and the relevant know-how was privy to nobles and knights. It was a necessity because Europe at the time had so many noble families that they could simply not be memorized. By applying heraldic symbolism and rules, however, the wearer and his dynasty could be identified from his battle pennants and coat of arms. Simplified heraldic symbolism was also used on the arms and equipment of urban militias and the attire of soldiers of a feudal lord. Houses and dwellings. The core of a medieval house, whether in a village or town, consisted of a kitchen, a hall, and a living room, hearth room. All were on the ground floor. From the 15th century onwards, upper stories started to be added. The walls were insulated from the outside with a clay daub, which also gave the house some fire protection. Windows were kept small to save heat. The grounds of the house were usually fenced in, and the courtyard had gates broad enough to admit a covered wagon. Attached to houses were utility buildings, barns, stables, outhouses, forges, and woodsheds or food granaries. Waste was taken outside the house into the fields or disposed into cesspits. Outside the house would be toilets built over sewage pits. A typical village house was single-story, with the front door leading into the courtyard into a central space, of which was a living room and a chamber. The houses were built on a wood or stone foundation. The izba, or main room of the village household, constituted the living space and kitchen, with an oven or a hearth. Above the hearth was a smoke hole to the roof space. Other areas served as stores for cereals, tools, food in jars or chests. Lighting was provided by torches, candles in pottery, candles in pottery candlesticks, and most of all by firelight from the hearth. The floor was compacted clay mixed with straw, leaves, or animal hair. The roof was typically thatched. Sheaves of rye or reed straw often doubled. In the front of the house was the garden and the courtyard with farm buildings for poultry, pigs, and cattle. Hunting was always a source of meat and furs, mainly for the lesser nobility. For the aristocracy, courtly hunting was more for enjoyment, being much cheaper entertainment than tourneys while providing similar thrills. Hunting became a favorite pastime, and chasing game with dogs became almost a ritual. Hunting weapons were similar to those used in battle: bows, crossbows, spears, daggers. Dogs were used to track and chase down game until the exhausted animal stood its ground in last defense. Then came the moment for the hunters, up till then only following the sound of baying hounds, to down the animal with an arrow or a spear. Finishing off on the ground was done with a sword or a dagger. Falconry, hunting with a falcon, originating in the Orient, and other specifically trained raptors, goshawks or sparrowhawks, was more of a fashion, a pursuit for both men and women. The poorer classes were not allowed to hunt in the forest, subject to strict penalties, with the exception of hare hunting. Okay, wait, what? So how, if hares were excluded from belonging to nobility, then why they are still marked as stolen if I hunt them in the forests? And why was such a big deal made about Hiniek hunting hares if that was supposedly legal? I don't quite understand. Hygiene. From the 13th century on, waste was dumped behind the house or buried in pits. Toilets consisted of cesspits topped off with a wooden superstructure with a seat or just a board. There were water drainage systems and no lack of freestanding latrines or outhouses, or at castles, privies. It was not uncommon for a latrine to be shared between several dwellings. In the inhospitable and badly heated castles, there were sometimes bathrooms with bathtubs or even plunge pools. Swimming was attractive not just as means of cleansing the body, but also for pleasure. In private houses, a bathroom was a sign of luxury and high status. That did not mean the wealthier residents washed more often, just that they were more readily able to put on clean clothes. The most common acts of hygiene included hand washing. Even the poorest homes, affording a basin with water pitcher or suspended water cistern with a faucet. The cleanest people were villagers, who would often wash in the stables or the river. The church was generally against cleansing the body, and so allowed the priests or monks to bathe only twice a year, at Christmas or on the feast day of some chosen patron. In spite of this, there were public baths in each town where people went not only to get clean, but also to socialize. Contrary to today's notions, the people of the time were not very prudish, and men and women shared the bathhouse together. Even the urban poor had the right to visit the baths, paid for by the municipality. Okay, I'm very weirded out by this game claiming that priests only bathe twice a year. Like, that sounds like an urban legend. To be honest, the amount of how dirty people were in the Middle Ages is like highly exaggerated, because it's not like those were still people. They are, you know, nobody would actually enjoy going around dirty for months at a time, and they had access to water. Like that, they had, you know, rivers. Usually, most towns or villages were situated by the river in the first place because they needed water, you know, to drink, sweet water, you know, for living. So it wouldn't be that big of a problem to bathe. And I somehow don't buy it that priests only bathe twice a year. Like, that seems crazy to me. It seems like an urban legend kind of thing. It's a pity that they don't give any sources, but I understand it would probably be too much to expect of a game to not only have such an extensive codex, but also give out sources. Like, obviously it's not an academic journal or anything. It's just a game. Invective. Even though the more educated or higher born tried to keep invective and vulgarities out of their speech, swearing has been part of the vernacular since time immemorial. Profanity was not only verbal, but often appeared in written form in documents that sought to defame and humiliate those addressed. Some of the slurs arose by corrupting foreign language expressions, while others were derived from animals and their attributes. Often used as insults were onomatopoeic words or metaphors, words derived from adjectives, attitudes towards work, criminal offenses, political stances, professions, psychological malaise, or people's names. The worst kind of insult questioned the honor of an individual. Such swear words often led to a court case or duel. It was common practice that anyone not prepared to defend their honor would indeed lose it in the eyes of those around. Jews. The Jews settled in Moravia and Bohemia probably even earlier than the 10th century. Initially they were considered foreigners who the Romans had banished into exile. Jewish traders in the Czech lands settled largely around the long-distance trade routes in major centers, which in the early Middle Ages were Olomouc, Brno, Znojmo, and the central Elbe River environs. Most lived in Prague, however. Records tell of about 120 houses in the demarcated Jewish quarter of the old town. They were under the legal protection of the decrees by Wenceslas II and subsequently Charles IV. Over the centuries, however, the flourishing of their activities as merchants and financiers gave rise to protests from many elements of the society, in particular the Catholic Church. The Jews had indeed imported valuable gold and used it to barter for horses, furs, or slaves. Their rights became progressively circumscribed. They could not buy land or houses, had to live in special designed ghettos, were allowed to lend money at interest, and to trade only where they were not in competition with locals, and were prohibited from working as craftsmen or farmers. The segregation of Jews was also underlined by enforced labeling. They had to wear, for example, a yellow circle or a yellow ribbon on their garments, a specifically shaped hat. The women had to have a yellow ribbon in their hair, and the men mandatory beards. No help came from the church, which traditionally laid blame on them for being the killers of Christ and for adhering to pagan rituals. In the Middle Ages, the Jews were considered to be king's own and under his protection, so that if the townspeople were inclined to commit a pogrom, to set fire to a quarter and massacre the inhabitants, they would have to pay the king hefty reparations. Some kings look forward to such pogroms as a good source of income. Others protected their Jews. For example, Wenceslas IV granted the Prague Jews the right to their own town within Prague, with its own walls and 6 gates, but even this failed to protect them from the pogrom in 1389, when the king was traveling abroad. After his return, he levied the ultimate punishment on the organizers of the pogrom, which quelled further attacks for a time, though they made a comeback with the Hussite movements. Okay, so the pogrom thing was less that you could request a permission to carry out a pogrom, but rather you had to pay the king for hurting his personal Jews. But I guess this states that sometimes the king was looking forward for you to do that, because then you would have to pay him. So it isn't out of the question that they would actually sometimes kind of encourage that almost, because that's pure profit for them. And you know, if a few Jews die, like, I guess there must have been people back then who wouldn't really have cared. Kitchens. Medieval kitchens differed in the countryside, the city, and at court. In earlier times, everything was cooked outdoors, while later, at the time of our narrative, stove hearths were built, which served for heating at the home as well as cooking. Some kitchens had an open fireplace indoors, with the smoke drawn off by small windows and fume hoods. When we speak of the so-called smoke kitchen or black kitchen, this was largely a feature of taverns, mills, presbyteries, and manors, which got its name from the smoke-blackened walls around it. A knighthood training. The physical training of a boy to become a knight began when he was 7 years old. He had to know how to run, jump, and climb well, and also to be able to swim. He strengthened his arm by throwing hefty rocks. Over the years, boys had to become proficient in spear throwing, archery, unarmed wrestling, horsemanship, parrying with a shield, and attacking. Their training also encompassed joining the hunt. The 7 knightly skills, according to the classical tradition, were horse riding, swimming, archery, fighting with a sword and unarmed, hunting, as well as playing chess and composing poetry. Similarly, burghers practiced combat with different types of weapons, which came into its own, especially in town defense. The towns, more often than anywhere else, spawned sword fighting and archery fellowships, where swordplay would be taught, initially according to the so-called German school, and later in the Renaissance dominated by the Italian and Spanish schools. Shooting fellowships were devoted to archery with bows and crossbows, and with the development of gunpowder, firearms came into play. A land army. The territorial army or the provincial militia drew on nobles with the retinues, the garrisons of clerical dignitaries, bishops, and from 1344 on, even the archbishops, the militias of royal town, village bailiffs, and custodians. It served to defend the land and was called up as needed by the monarch. Language and literature. In the late 14th and early 15th century, both Czech and German were spoken in the Czech lands. German first appeared after German's colonization made its way largely into the towns, the upper classes, and literature, love poems, and bureaucratic language. Czech had evolved from Old Slavonic and was spoken by the poorer residents, becoming an official language only during the reign of Charles IV. Apart from those two languages, there was Latin, the language of books, chronicles, learned treatises, official deeds, and documents. Latin was the language of the Church and the Bible, and served as the medium of international communication. The development of the Slavic language and its participation and its emancipation was the domain of the monasteries, including Sassau, from the early Middle Ages on. The preacher Jan Hus was one of the pioneers fostering the Czech language. As for the literature, Czech found its due place from the early 14th century in various genres: spiritual and secular lyricism, love stories, epics, and dramas. Among the oldest examples were the legends, for example about Judas Iscariot, Pontius Pilate and the lives of the saints, knightly epics, chronicles and satires. Apart from official documents in Latin, correspondence was written in Czech from the end of the 14th century. Liturgical items. Church fixtures and fittings comprised the liturgical devices used in church services and statues. Paintings and frescoes which served to enlighten the uneducated populace in the simple terms about biblical stories and religious observance. Pulpit, the raised platform from which the priest gives out sermons or readings. Altar, where the sacrifice of communion is consecrated. This could be in the main or side aisle, often highly ornate. Ciborium, the receptacle for the Eucharist, the transformed sacred host. Chalice, the Eucharistic goblet for the wine, transformed into the blood of Christ. Paten, the shallow bowl or plate used to hold the sacred host. Monstrance, the ornate casket to hold the Eucharist. Liturgy. Religious services in the Middle Ages were held quietly and in Latin. A medieval mass differed from today's in its language, approach and the relationship between the priest and the congregation. People stood or moved around, while the priest said the liturgy alone, without servers, without sermon and without communion. He stood with his back to the congregation, facing the main altar at a distance from the faithful. The sermon was held quite apart from the Mass, in keeping with the special rite, and in between services of worship. Holy Communion, the Eucharist, was available to the common folk only at Christmas or Easter. The inaccessibility of the sacred ritual, along with the disgust at the state of the Church, later led to the revolutionary Hussite reform movement, which opened up both the Mass and the Eucharist rites to the widest populace. Okay, to be honest, I didn't know that. I didn't know that they used to conduct the Eucharist for like regular people, even like only like twice a year. Because obviously I'm not religious myself. At this point, I don't care about religion, and in fact I have some strong words to, well, actually saying that I don't care is perhaps even a little too generous, because at this point I have some strong choice words to say about religion, but that's maybe not the best time. But you know, even for me as a non-religious person, I remember from my childhood and generally in my sort of perception of what the Mass is supposed to be about, you know, the supposed divine transcendence of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ is like the main part of why you even go to a Mass. So it's weird to me that they only did it twice a year in the Middle Ages, apparently. But I guess it's not that they only did it twice a year. They did it always, but only the priest partook in it. The rest were just, I don't know, watching. Locks. Locks and keys in ancient times were made of wood and later of metal. Progress came with the year 1000 with the invention of automatically falling latches and the wider use of key locks. Fixed locks were supplemented by padlocks protected by a metal casing. In Middle Ages, there were also padlock systems in use, as well as more advanced designs with a turning key. According to archaeological finds, locks were commonly used in the country. Even though ordinary latches were typical, the richer townspeople and nobility had their locks richly decorated. As late as the 14th century, locks were fitted to the outside of the door. Money. Currency in the Middle Ages took the form of coins minted in denominations corresponding to the quantity of their precious material used. In Bohemia, the silver Prague groschen served as the legal tender. The decimal system was not in general use. 1 groschen divided into 7 pennies, and those in turn into 14 hellers. Similarly, counting and calculating was done in a dozen and 3 scopes, a copper, 60. However, since this would be rather confusing for us today, the smallest unit of value in the game is 0.1 groschen. Around the year 1400, the quality and hence the value of the groschen dropped significantly, with other metals being added to the silver. This was to do with the overexploitation of the mining deposits and the most valuable metals around Kuttenberg, Central Bohemia and Iglau in Moravia, and a shortage of goods for exchange with foreign customers. Economic and financial problems at the time led to growing anti-Semitism, a rise in crime, and ultimately to the collapse of the Czech currency. Counterfeit coins were in circulation alongside genuine ones, despite the fact that counterfeiting was one of the most serious crimes and was punished by burning at the stake. Coins were circular and marked with a crown or the crowned head of a monarch on the obverse, and in Bohemia, the Czech lion in a square on the reverse, substituted by an eagle in Moravia. Similar silver coins were minted right up to the Hussite Wars. The mint employed 2 mint masters to vouch for the precious material quantity for the coins under mortal oath. The prices of goods and articles varied locally and changed frequently. Okay, so I guess if it was found out that the officially minted currency did not meet the standards of how much precious material there should be inside, one was legally allowed to execute the mint master. Like, it says here that they swore a mortal oath. So I guess not looking after the currency properly was a capital offense. Morgue. The morgue was a simple building of wood or stone built near a church in a corner of a cemetery. It was the place where biers and coffins with the deceased were put. Here the family kept vigil over the body after departed and prepared for its burial. Municipal finances. Towns and cities always had to look after their budget, so they collected taxes, custom duties, tolls and ungeld good tariffs. The most common form of tax was paid twice a year in an amount dependent on the assets of each respective citizen. Another source of civic revenue money were monies made by the city council or the city court for making of the contracts, documents, records and other ongoing activities. Fees and taxes were paid by the city residents based on their businesses, levied on products sold or services provided. The treasury also collected money from for interest payments, fines, building funds, loans, and various forms of letting and rentals to serfs. Written records were maintained of all revenues. The city council paid out some of the money for the purchase of real estate, paid the nobility for defense and security, invested in schools, civic cultural development, churches, administration, and the salaries for city officials, construction, operation, and maintenance and the upkeep of municipal buildings. Music. Until the 11th century, music and singing were mostly liturgical, though also associated with everyday activities. In the world of religion, there were the Gregorian chants, taking their name from the Pope Gregory the Great, or musical forms with Latin singing, unaccompanied by instruments, used in the rites of the Roman Catholic Church. The Middle Ages were not adverse to singing, but a difficult time for musical instruments, since the Church frowned upon any kind of music other than vocal. For centuries, therefore, the instruments of old continued to be used, and no new ones were invented. Instrumental music in its own right gained prominence only in the 14th century, in the Ars Nova or the New Art period. The concept of original music work or composition was yet unknown. Music arose mostly from improvisation, and musical works were learned off by heart and spread by oral transmission. Names and surnames. The period up to the 13th century was characterized by Slavonic names, mostly of pagan origin. Common people would keep names short and simple like Odolen the robust, Dobrosh the good, Shval the praised. Names were also given according to the place in society. Compound names such as Drahomira, one who values peace, Bolesław, more famed, more fabled, and Ludmila, dear to the people, were reserved for royalty and the nobility. Christian names were derived from Latin: Paul, Sylvester, Florian; Hebrew: James, Daniel, John; Greek: Andrew, Nicholas, Peter. Once Christianity took over completely, only names belonging to Christian martyrs were permitted. In the towns and the countryside, the prevailing names were John, Peter, Margaret, Catherine, and Anna, while the nobility retained the privilege of using names like Sophia, Elizabeth, Jacob, Ulrich, or Hermann. Additionally, by-names added information about the location of the family seat, social and religious standing, or about relationships with relatives. For example, Divish Stamberka, in KCD, Divish of Talmberg, Jan Ptaczek z Pirksteina, Hans Kapon of Pirkstein, Hanusz, syn Jindricha, Hanusz of Pirkstein, son of Henry. In addition, sometimes an epithet would be used, such as Jan Zając, Hanekin Hare, or Waldek, Jan the Younger, or Haradek, of Hradek. Okay, the growing population and the limited number of first names gave rise to the surname as we know it today. The surname was derived from the place where the person lived, like in English, for example, hill, woods, or forest; from their occupation, coachman, miller, or smith; from their physiognomy or appearance, ruddy, small, brown; or they were patronymics derived from the father's forename, Davis, Little John; or matronymics derived from the mother's forename, Mariotte, Biton. Nobility. The nobility, aristocracy, was the highest feudal society beneath the monarch, with the power and legal privileges commensurate with the landed title and family crest. They were directly answerable to the king, and the lands in their possession were only on leasehold, for which they had to pay the king dues, and were obliged to provide military service in the event of a war. Noble status was hereditary, as were the associated land rights and responsibilities. The land came with its inhabitants, who had to pay their liege lord rent and labor on his farmlands. The oldest Czech families include the lords of Butic, for example, the Zając family of Hasenberg, of Benešov from Danuba and Kraven, of Ronov from Lipa and Dauba, and the Rosenbergs. In the 14th century, the Czech title Pan, Lord, was reserved for the wealthy members of the higher nobility, who had the right to elect the king and sit in the territorial diet or the Landtag, but later spread to the lower nobility, church dignitaries, members of town councils, and eventually to common burghers, becoming the equivalent of Mr. in English as we know it today. It's actually the same in Polish. Pan is like, and I guess the etymology is exactly the same, because technically speaking, like etymologically speaking, I guess Pan originally did mean Lord. It still has this meaning, but nowadays it's also a very common everyday honorific, used exactly as described here. It's basically the equivalent of Mr. A seigneur or lord of the manor, in Czech Zeman, was a provincial nobleman of local origin, long established in a given territory. A baronet, Władysza, administered numerous estates. Yeomen, who formed the lower nobility, had no property of their own and served the higher nobility. Nobility unquestionably influenced medieval art, since they were often the sponsors of artistic works. This applied not only to architecture, painting and sculptures, but also to fashion accessories, hairstyles and furniture. Paganism. Pagan ways survived in Bohemia even after the adoption of Christianity, mainly in the form of folk traditions and customs. These contain elements from the cultures of the Celts, Germans and Slavs, their respective influence intermingling over time and becoming more and more adapted to Christianity. Some of the customs kept their original form, for example, folk superstitions and rhymes. Others gave way to the church pressure completely. Paganism in the Slavic countries survived in the motifs adorning jewelry and objects, in folk medicine, and in form of the holidays, the winter and summer solstices, the Mardi Gras, Easter, Walpurgis Night, Midsummer Night, All Souls, Advent, and Christmas. All were modeled on original pagan celebrations, but were renamed after Christianity and modified in content. Pennants and banners. In the heat of a medieval battle, where most of the combatants had the same or similar equipment, the pennant or banner was often the only sign differentiating friend or foe. Pennants also helped lift morale to organize the various units during troop movements. Around 1400s, pennants and banners took the shape of extended triangles, upright rectangles or squares. Flags were fashioned from colored canvas or silk, and the depiction or emblems were painted onto them, most often the coats of arms of the respective feudal lords. Cavalry carried small pennants on their spears, and craftsmen who were members of the guild also had their own banners. The guild banners were emblematic of the profession and were shown at public ceremonies and at military and other ostentatious events. The banner of the Czech lands dates back to the 13th century and depicts a lion rampant. That's a heraldic description. I don't know most of those words. I assume at least some of them are kind of like French or something. So they depicted a two-tailed silver lion raised on its hind legs on a red background. Wait. Are you trying to tell me that the medieval banner for Bohemia was basically the Lannister coat of arms? Because well, I guess it's more of a because the Lannisters have a golden lion and this is a silver lion, but still pretty close because the red background and it's standing on its hind legs. Pillory. The pillory would be located in the middle of the square, and it was where the lesser punishments were meted out for transgressions such as perjury, slander, or various frauds. It was typically a wooden or stone pillar to which the convicted were tied by a chain for a specific time, hours, or even days. They were then punished by the whole community, being spat on, insulted, mocked, and pelted randomly on a daily basis. Prayer. The earliest prayers were dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Hail Mary, in Latin Ave Maria, beneath thy protection, sub tuum presidium, with a rosary and numerous litanies. The prayers followed the pagan formulations, which were modified with the adoption of Christianity to fit the new doctrine. In addition to the Marian prayers, the most frequently chanted were the Lord's Prayer, the Credo, Declaration of Faith, and the Angel of the Lord. Litanies were dedicated primarily to Christ, but also to the other saints. The priest would incant, and the people would respond, Kyrie eleison. The monks knew and used many more prayers related to the daily cycle. Hermits and others who dedicated themselves to God in solitude recited the scripture and psalms. During the liturgy, the prevailing language was Latin, with some prayers or songs in the vernacular. For example, Lord be kind unto us, or Saint Wenceslas. A Roman Catholic Church. In the pre-Hussite period, the Catholic Church held extensive estates, sometimes exceeding in value the property of the nobility, or even the king itself, or rather himself. The Church also collected various taxes and fees, which led to conflicts not only between the Church and the secular world, but also within the Church itself. In addition to the clergymen, priests and their helpers, the ecclesiastical establishment was also represented by votaries, archbishops, church officials, clerics and monks. Altogether, the Church nourished and employed about the tenth of the population. High running costs and failure to ensure either the physical or spiritual being of the populace, coupled with the numerous woes and wars and pestilence, led to a radical weakening of the ecclesiastical power and the loss of the confidence in the Church as an institution in the 14th century. It brought the first signs of the Reformation movement, as well as many alternative heretical sects and a renewed interest in old pagan traditions. Mass was at the time more of a social occasion than a spiritual one, bringing people together. They would enjoy themselves, even flirt or make deals. This was changed with the Hussite Reformation movement and the return to true devotion. Declining trust in the Church was encouraged by the first Czech translations of the Bible, thanks to which the ideas actually contained in the Bible would finally be spread by word of mouth, even among the illiterate population. The spark of revolution has been struck. Safe Conduct. The Safe Conduct document was issued by a member of the highest social tier to guarantee the bearer's safety. Most often it gave protection in a particular territory during the journey, and sometimes the bearer was also provided with an armed escort. For example, Jan Hus received a letter of safe conduct from Sigismund of Luxembourg when he went to the Council of Constance. He did indeed survive the journey in good health, though the safe conduct did nothing to save him from being sentenced by the ecclesiastical court and burned at the stake. Yeah, not much of a safe passage. Well, I guess it was safe passage. They didn't make any promises on what would happen once you get there. Schools. School-based tuition developed only at the end of the 11th century, mainly in the monasteries and churches. Basic instruction held in Latin encompassed the seven liberal arts: the trivium, grammar, Latin, rhetoric, dialectic, and the quadrivium, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and church music. During the High Middle Ages, there were two-tier Latin schools for boys. Girls were only very rarely educated. Indeed, education in general did not carry the weight it does today. Most noblemen and wealthy burghers were illiterate, hiring scribes and scriveners as needed. Later on, the towns came to host centers of secular education, with the ultimate flowering thereof being the establishment in 1348 of the International Format University in Prague by Emperor Charles IV. A slaughterhouse or shambles was located at the edge of the town. This was the only place that the animals could be slaughtered, with butchers' stalls springing around them. The cattle was examined by the guildmaster. Only if he vouched for their health could they be slaughtered and sold by the butchers. Butchering elsewhere was punishable by a fine. Sources of light. The main source of domestic light after sunset consisted of fire pits or a fireplace. It was not enough to light up paths or dwellings. Cloth or tallow torches. If that was not enough to light up paths or dwellings, cloth or tallow torches, oil lamps, lanterns, candlesticks or candles were used. Ceramic or metal oil lamps were bowl shapes, sometimes with an ear-shaped handle. In them was a wick steeped in oil and later supplemented with wax. In the richer homes, there were chandeliers with candles hanging on from chains from the ceiling. In the villages, there were simple lamps, burning tallow instead of vegetable oil, and torches made of split lumber. Tallow candles stank, smoked and dripped. They had to be constantly wiped, and the tallow collected for reuse, and therefore they were mounted on candlesticks with a bowl at the base. In Central Europe in the Middle Ages, beeswax was considered an extremely precious commodity and also made an appearance as a means of exchange among the guild, payment in wax. Saint Wenceslaus' crown. After the coronation of Charles IV as King of Bohemia, a new and singular ceremonial jewel was fashioned, the crown of Saint Wenceslaus. It was made from the old Przemyślid crown, and the monarch himself dedicated it to Saint Wenceslaus. No Czech king was ever allowed to wear it, but he could borrow it for his coronation for a fee. The crown is of pure gold, with gemstones and pearls, kept in the stone room with 7 locks above the chapel of St. Wenceslaus in Prague Cathedral. The keys are held by the leaders of the Czech state, the president, the prime minister, the Archbishop of Prague, etc. There is a legend that if the crown is worn on the head of anyone other than the rightful Czech king, the wearer will soon die. It is reported that during World War II, the Nazi Reich protector for Bohemia and Moravia, Reinhard Heydrich, put it on and died shortly afterwards at the hand of assassins. The story is probably apocryphal, but certainly interesting. Tithes. As a tithe is the name for the compulsory tax levied since ancient times. It was paid to the parish priest or other religious institution. The term tithe comes from the Old English and means 1/10. The amount of the tithe being 1/10 of the value of harvest. The inhabitants of a monastery estate had the misfortune to be taxed twice by the church, once in form of a tithe, and the second time as a mandatory levy for the occupation of church land. Toilets. In the countryside or during wars, people went outdoors to relieve themselves, to the cowshed or the dung heap in the yard. Houses of higher social standing had a little hut built by the dung heap. At night, chamber pots were used, tucked under beds, and were emptied on the dung heap in the morning. In the castles and in wealthier homes, we would find a privy, a toilet located whenever possible in one of the heated rooms in an oriel on the first floor. There wasn't necessarily a door inside. And inside was a bench seat with a round hole. Not uncommonly, it was in the banquet hall itself, so one would not have to depart, and could even observe the goings-on from the privy. The privies used to be in a niche cut out in the wall, with a sloping vent shaft leading to the outside of the building. In either case, the fecal matter would fall freely alongside the castle walls into the ditch or down the slope. Privies were gradually upgraded and flushed through with rainwater. They might also have a flap added that discharged the excrement once the flap was released by a foot lever. Despite this, up to the 16th century, it was common practice to empty chamber pots out of the windows onto the city streets. Town gates. The city gates, they were always at least 2, served to watch over the comings and goings of the city dwellers, and tolls and duties were collected there from traders for goods bought and sold. The ground level housed the armory and storage facilities, and the highest level featured an astronomical clock or town clock. The gate tower was typically a rectangular tower of greater or lesser height, with a passage through and a drawbridge over the frontal moat. The walls in some cities also include a water gate, through which the townspeople made their way to the water supply. There were also dedicated gates for the executioner and his henchmen, for unclean people, as well as Jewish gates. After closing time, it was only permitted to enter the city with a special permit from the councillors. Anyone who failed to make it back in time would have to spend the night outside the city walls. The gate was locked with a key that was kept overnight with the bailiff or the head of the city council. Towns and cities. In the Middle Ages, the merchant settlements and villages on major trade routes or around castles became the first towns. They were founded by specialized businessmen called allocators. Their task was to seek out settlers, to prepare and apportion the land, and to build a community. The ruler set down the rights and obligations concerning the locators and settlers, for example, the level and method of collecting taxes and benefits, town privilege rules of self-government, capital justice rights, trading, market rights, and 1 mile rights, extending to 1 mile behind the city walls, and brewing and handling beer, brewing rights. Newly established settlements and cities were often exempt from taxes for a certain period. Hence many Czech villages are called lota or grace period. Towns were of different types: royal, seigneurial, mining or dowry, which belonged to the queen. Seigneurial towns were divided into ecclesiastical, secular, feudal, and those of the royal chamber. Apart from the feudal settlements, towns were mostly rectangular in layouts, with streets perpendicular to the central square, featuring a rathouse, town hall, market, and church. Until the 14th century, the main streets and squares of the large towns remained unpaved, uncobbled. Waste was emptied directly into the streets or thrown into the waste pits dug around the houses, despite the fact that sanitation had existed since antiquity. Gutters of rammed earth carried sewage and rainwater alongside the streets, and an unpleasant smell remained hovering over the town. Settlements were surrounded by wooden palisades, and from the second half of the 13th century, there had to be at least 2 gates through it. In KCD, we reconstructed the towns based on a range of medieval designs, mostly larger and wealthier than they were in reality. Traveling and traveling merchants. Travel was dangerous in the Middle Ages, but necessary, especially for traders. The roads differed by their purpose. Trade routes had river fords, bridges, inns, signposts, milestones, and so on. Pilgrimage routes were without such luxuries. A person was able to cover around 25 to 30 kilometers per day by a wagon. Wayfarers would overnight at inns near road junctions, their goods stored in a depot. In times of instability and chaos, the kind of which the KCD story takes place, travelers and traders would often be waylaid by marauders, which led to traveling in groups with a hired armed escort. Bohemia imported canvas, silk, and other textiles, weapons, wine, salt, seafood, saltwater fish, southern fruit, spices, and other exotic goods. Goods exported included wheat, butter, honey, beeswax, beer, malt, freshwater fish, cheeses, and other local products. Trial by ordeal. Apart from the resolution by municipal or territorial courts of justice, up to the 14th century it was common, though unofficial in Bohemia, to turn to God's judgment or trial by ordeal. Guilt or innocence was proved by appealing to God. He had to judge guilt or innocence. A typical ordeal was to be put to the test by fire, hot water, poison, or dueling with a contemporary. the trial often ended in injury or even death of the accused or the accuser. Now, actually, one of the funniest trials by ordeal that I've read about was, how would you say it in English? It was like the ordeal of a blessed bite. Like, it was, because there were different kinds of ordeals, and it seems to me from the description, how it was explained to me at the university when I was learning about it, is that this particular ordeal, quote unquote, was mostly reserved for people like, you know, church officials or people of high social standing who were supposed to pass, as it were, because it basically it involved eating like a very dry piece of pie or something, and like the only way you could fail that is if you somehow choked on it, which meant you were guilty. But if you didn't, then I guess you were not. I will try finding some primary, well, not primary, but some sources on that and put them in the description, because to be honest, now that I think about it, that also sounds kind of weird, but I did hear about it, you know, on the university. Like I learned about it in class. It was a class about archaeological findings connected with law, and about weird customs, historical customs connected with law. So it would be weird if one of the professors at the university lied to me, but you know, everything is possible. I will try to look up for some sources for that and put them in the description. University, well, speak of the devil. One of the oldest universities in Europe was the Prague University, later Charles University. Founded in 1348 by Charles IV, students could study here at arts, theological, medical, and later on law faculties or schools. The arts faculty broadened basic religious education and taught grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In the early 15th century, more than 1,000 students were taught here and were also provided with college accommodation. A total of 80% of the students at the university came from abroad, mainly from Hungary, Austria, Poland, and Germany. The medieval university allowed one to graduate with a bachelor's or a master's degree or doctorate, conditional or passing a spoken viva voce examination by a commission. Some disciplines were studied for far longer than today, even more than 10 years. After passing the final examination, the student received a diploma. From the earliest times, the university was headed by a rector, assisted by deans of various faculties, followed by the members of the university council, and below them the numerous tutors, professors and cantors. Among others who learned at the university, who lectured at the university, was the preacher and the reformer Jan Hus. Venoms and poisons. A fairly common method of dealing with socio-political issues. The most commonly used poisons were the alkaloids of herbane, the tura flower, devil's snare, hemlock, or of toadstools mixed into food and drink. Among the most popular drugs were those inducing abortion, aphrodisiacs, analgesics, antiseptics, digestives, laxatives, narcotics to induce sleep or with soothing effects, and tonics to revitalize and give sustenance to the body. One of the worst cases of food poisoning that impacted the wider rural population involved rye infected with parasitic ergofungus. Before the source of the poisoning was discovered, thousands of people could be affected, which often led to accusations against some local witch, since ergo in sublethal dose brings on delirium and hallucinations. Indeed, quite often, The underlying cause of witchery superstitions and allegations was nothing other than intoxication by psychoactive substances, sometimes used in the making of lotions and potions. Village. Bohemian villages underwent significant transformation at the end of the 13th and the 14th centuries. Farmers became to be entitled to inherit their farms, and wages and trading began to have clear-cut rules. The village ground plan itself changed from erratically scattered homesteads toward organized plots, geometrically arranged, affording plenty of space for road and the market. The number of houses ranged from 20 to 25. The hub of the village was the common or public space, which served as a social, cultural, and economic arena. The limits of the township were fenced or walled. Watermills. By the end of the 14th century, most rural towns had on average up to 7 mills, water-powered forging mills, wash mills, sawmills, water pumps, bellows in foundries and smelters, and for beating hemp. Each mill consisted of 3 parts: the engine, the transmission system, and the work equipment. The driving mechanism or engine was a water wheel, and the gearing or the transmission system consisted of the many gears to convert the force from the slow-moving wheel to fast motion. Work equipment differed according to the particular function of the mill. At the heart of grain mills were millstones, a lower stationary bedstone, and an upper running runner. The grain was ground between the two. The mill had to be well situated. The current had to be neither too weak nor too strong, and in the Czech climate, the strength of the current in the river varied greatly with the season. This meant the miller also had to build artificial mill runs and weirs with which to control the flow. Weapons. Weapons were made of wood, stone, bone and antler served mankind since prehistoric times. Initially, given the materials, the weapons of choice were pointed for stabbing, spears, knives, arrows, etc. Later, with the development in metalworking, bladed weapons began to emerge: daggers, axes, and swords. In addition to these 2 types, we also distinguish blunt weapons, thrown weapons, hand firearms, artillery, and booby traps. In the Middle Ages, there were also plenty of lances, halberds, and crossbows. Rural weaponry was often derived from farming tools. From the 14th century, Europe began deploying cannon using gunpowder, long known in China, and firearms began to make slow inroads. Surviving records of the use of small arms in Czech lands date back to the reign of Wenceslaus IV. They were used in the 1398 during the siege of the Archbishop's mansion near Prague. Windmills. Windmills became prevalent in Europe between the 11th and 14th centuries. The most suitable environments for their construction was to be found in the foothills of mountains, on plains or coastal landscapes where strong air currents abounded. They were generally wooden post mills, standing on characteristic conical trestle log base. Okay, I was actually wondering about that, because it was very weird to me how the windmill had a very small base. They would be rotated around the central stake to face into the wind. Wow, really? They could so I guess that's why it's so small, because it's like a central pole on which the whole mill could turn. Like, that's actually very impressive when you think about it. I totally didn't know that. That's pretty awesome, actually. As a rule, the mill had 4 vanes, sails set in a rectangular cross mounted on the front wall of the building. As the wind leant into them, they would turn to move a wooden gearing and transfer the torque into the millstones located on the first stone. The disadvantages of windmills was their frequent need of repair and maintenance, and they were often struck by lightning. When operating, they vibrated intensely, making working in them neither pleasant nor safe. Yeah, I would imagine if the whole building turned. That's pretty hardcore. Witchcraft. In the Czech lands, any practices, especially by women, connected with magic that were intended to harm rather than help, were regarded as witchcraft. In the early Middle Ages, witchcraft was differentiated into white magic, beneficial and associated with healing, and black magic, curses, hexes, and abuse of magic for inquisitorious purposes. Magic encompassing divination, necromancy, alchemy, herbalism, entrenched pagan customs and rituals, which had originally constituted an integral part of medieval society. By the end of 15th century, efforts to eradicate witchcraft culminated in senseless witch hunts and persecution of anyone involved with magic. The persecution peaked around the end of the 16th century, when hundreds of people fell victim to the zeal of the witch hunters. Many superstitions and half-truths have arisen concerning witchcraft, as well as the Inquisition, though only a few are grounded in truth. Although many were convicted and condemned during the period, most of those accused of heresy or witchcraft got off unscathed. On the contrary, it was often those who had denounced them with the acquisitive intent, and whose accusations were proven to be false, that were punished. More people fell prey to lynch mobs and fanatical self-proclaimed inquisitors than to institutionalized witch burnings. Women in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, purely patriarchal society, the man was the head of the family, with the roles of the woman determined by his relationship to him. Daughter, sister, wife, mother, or widow. Girls had short childhood, according to municipal documents, reaching the age of majority between 12 and 15 years of age. Boys, in terms of territorial law, became grown-ups at 15. Men spent most of their time at their craft, trading or swordsmanship, depending on their station in life, while women attending to the housework and family. Only a widow could obtain permission to conduct trade or craft activity with the help of the journeyman, of course. Village women did not leave their homes very much or wander the vicinity needlessly. Some rules about venturing out were dictated by social class. While townswomen and noblewomen could venture out beyond their home, only when accompanied by a spouse or servants, the wives of artisans, merchants or peasants could walk about unaccompanied. The domestic activities of the well-to-do women included embroidery, cleaning, childcare, shopping, and playing musical instruments. Village women spent their time working in the fields or pastures, beekeeping, weaving, spinning, preparing food, knitting or sewing. During the Middle Ages, the ideal of beauty was a thin, pale woman with long blonde hair, small rounded breasts, relatively narrow hips, and narrow waist. The most important thing was, of course, health and fertility. A woman in the Middle Ages would, from the beginning of sexual maturity, be pregnant virtually every year. It was not unusual for one to be a mother 3 or 4 times over by the age of 20. Births were complicated and aftercare inadequate, so the risk of death in childbirth was great. Girls were afforded less attention than boys, but when it came to their honor, the contrary applied. Old maids, seduced daughters, and unmarried women brought the family shame. While boys inherited their livelihood, the parents of the girls had to accumulate a dowry with which to compensate the bridegroom. Woods. Forests belonged to the king, especially along the border zones, and played not only an economic but also a strategic role. Felled trees were used to form a fortification called the abattises. From the 14th century on, it was considered proper to look after the forests, and only the ruler could decree whether his subject could cut down trees for construction. The ruler could also allow farmer rights to graze their livestock or to make charcoal, but on the condition that the hinds But on the condition that the hinds and does could not bear their young unhindered. The subjects had to cut the grass and dry the hay on the forest meadows and were allowed to catch hares. Hunting of other game by anyone except for the owner of this land or his appointed huntsman was however prohibited under strict penalties. In the forest of the time, the tree cover was largely of beech and fir and mixed oak, in which only a certain timber varieties would be felled, oak for water structure, beech for charcoal burning, etc. Overall, forests cover in the Middle Ages suffered considerable intervention and in some places was completely wiped out. Whoa, I'm almost completely wiped out from reading that, but I will continue. How many things in the other? Okay, you know what? I am going to pause that. Like I will read the other categories some other time because that was too long. Like I need a break. Yeah, I am going to pause here. I am going to read the rest of the codex, like, you know, sometime in the future. I will also denote it clearly as a separate episode, so you can just skip it. For now, that's all for this one, and I will see you in the next one, by which the regular gameplay will resume. For now, that's all. Bye.